Hello and welcome to this webinar on college debt and college credit. I am very happy that you're joining me today. My name is Todd Christensen, Director of Education at Debt Reduction Services, Inc., a nonprofit credit counseling agency. Title of today's presentation, From IOU to I Owe Nobody. That's the goal. Get rid of debt, prevent debt, any kind of debt, especially today we're talking about student loan debt. So what we're going to do is start off and just briefly introduce Debt Reduction Services, who we are, why we do what we do. We've been around, we're a nonprofit credit counseling agency. We've been around since '96, and we are a nonprofit because of the financial education that we do, not only just these kind of pre-recorded webinars, but the hundreds of classes that we do around the country each year, from kindergarten all the way through college and into adult education as well. So let's get right into it. What's the goal here today? What do we hope to accomplish? Well, the idea is to, first of all, prevent debt. What debt we can't prevent, we want to minimize it. And then any debt that we do get into, we want to make sure that we know how to best and most expeditiously eliminate it. Why? I mean, why does it matter? Well, like even at a low interest rate on student loans, typically are capped, but even if it's on a fairly low interest rate at 4.5%, it's going to add up and could significantly increase the amount of debt that we pay over time. Let's take an example here. It's a little above average, but not too far above average for the average typical student graduating with a bachelor's. But let's say they had $40,000 of student loan at a 4.5% interest rate. You can see that the bars, the red, white, and blue bars indicate the monthly payment, or how much we're paying. And this also represents an extended repayment plan. The standard plan is a 10-year repayment. This one shows a 20-year repayment, extended over 20 years instead of the 10. So each month we're making these payments. Over on the left, we're paying 100% of the monthly payment that is required. Over on the right indicates how much debt we originally took out, the $40,000, and how much of each of those payments you can see is going toward interest, and what's going toward the actual balance and paying down the debt. The red is what is going just to interest, and the blue of that whole payment, the blue portion shows how much is actually going to pay down the debt. So you can see in the early years, more than half of every payment that we're making is going just to interest. So the longer we extend it out, the more interest we pay. And you see that yellow bar going from the top left to the bottom right, that is the actual balance. It's not a straight line because it takes a while for our payments to go more toward the actual balance rather than just the interest. And that's true for just about any debt, whether it's a home loan or a car loan. Early payments are mostly interest. That's why if we can make extra payments early on in any kind of debt, installment loan like this, a monthly payment, we're going to pay it off faster and save ourselves money in the long run. So what kind of money are we talking about? On a $40,000 loan at 4.5% interest over 20 years, oh, it's a cliffhanger. Please, if you're taking this webinar for credit, please write this passcode down. You're going to need 3 passcodes to take the quiz after you watch this, finish this webinar. You'll go back to where you found the webinar link. There'll be also a link there to a quiz. And the first passcode is FARM, F-A-R-M, FARM. So how much interest is somebody going to pay on a $40,000 loan at 4.5% interest rate over 20 years? The answer is $21,000, more or less. That's 50% increase in the amount of debt over the original balance. That's why preventing, first of all, is ideal, and minimizing how much debt we get into and then eliminating it as quickly as possible is so important, because the longer we take to pay it off, the more we end up having to pay off. So that's the goal here today. We're going to kind of go through this 3 steps. We're going to talk about how to minimize debt, prevent debt, and do all that before school even starts, before we get into school. And you might think, well, if you're already in school, you might think, well, that's not relevant to me. I'm already in school. Au contraire, there are some things that we can do to actually minimize debt using tools or methods that are typically come into play before we get into school, but we can actually use even after we get into school. So what we're going to start with, we're going to talk about these some savings products. The 529 College Savings Plan, typically known as the 529 Plan, which is administered through your state's treasurer's office. Virtually all of these that I know of are housed in the state treasurer's office. The 529 is an investment account specifically for college expenses. The earnings grow tax-free. There is no limit to the amount of contributions. There are some special state tax incentives. You can get special state income deductions in certain states. But the expenses, or the money that grows there, that is invested there, can only be used for certain college expenses. Currently, that would include things like tuition, fees, books, supplies, and possibly room and board. And there are some states that also allow you to use this money for the concurrent credit in a high school class, if there is that available. These accounts are in the name of the student, not the parent, and they must be used for a 2 to 4 or 4-year college or university, graduate schools, vocational technical schools, some qualified career retraining schools, and as I mentioned, the dual credit courses in many high schools. So here's the question. Is a family member or friend helping you pay for your college? Let them know that they can get tax deductions, tax advantages, by simply channeling the money through the 529 plan. The money does not have to stay there for more than a very short period. It may be either 10 days or 2 weeks. It's a very short period. And then when it comes back out, it is you receive that tax deduction. Make sure that it is, of course, in the same year as that the expenses are that the money is expensed in the same year that the money is withdrawn from the account. Now, I have to explain, I am not an accountant. This is not tax advisor. This is not tax advice. So do see a tax professional for more information on that. Also start with the treasurer's office to get some more information. Great program to start with. And so even while you're in school, if you're channeling your expenses, some of your money through a 529 plan, you get some of that can get some of that tax deduction benefit to help minimize your tax liability at the end of the year. The Coverdell is also known as the Coverdell ESA. Coverdell, excuse me, Education Savings Plan. Also, earnings grow tax-free. There is a $2,000 annual contribution limit, but it can be used for college and or high school expenses. Both do typically require, as I mentioned, expenditures in the same year as the withdrawal. So, for example, you don't want to take money out on December 15th and then pay tuition in January of the next month, because then there'll be a penalty for doing that. Okay, debt limits. How much can you borrow? How much should you borrow? There are restrictions on how much we can borrow, and depending on the type of loan, if it's a government student loan or if it's a private student loan. But here's the government limitations currently, and these are subject to change anytime. Of course, Congress has a whim to change them. But if you are a dependent undergraduate, you can borrow only about $5,500 a year if you're a freshman, and only $3,500 of that can be subsidized, meaning only $3,500 of that can be a loan where the government pays the interest rate while you're in school. That's a subsidized loan. If you're getting into an unsubsidized loan, that means the interest is accruing even while you're enrolled in school. And so if you borrow the money at the beginning of the year, at the end of the year you'll owe more money than at the beginning of the year because the interest is adding itself and compounding onto your debt. Sophomores can borrow more. Juniors and seniors and beyond can borrow even more than that. That's if you're a dependent undergraduate. If you're an independent undergraduate, meaning that you're living on your own and can't be claimed by anyone as a dependent for their taxes, freshmen can borrow as much as $9,500, all the way up to juniors and seniors can borrow as much as $12,500. But again, even of that, only $5,500 can be a subsidized loan. Cumulative total currently for dependents, it's $31,000. For undergraduate or independent students, it's $57,000 over their studies. So there are definite limitations. Here's what I always bring up when I'm doing this class at different colleges and universities around the state and country. I make sure that everybody understands that just because the government is willing to lend you the money does not mean you should take it. I made that mistake when I was in college. I figured, hey, if they're going to offer me the money, I'm going to take it and use it because it's supposedly a great interest rate, and it's a, student loan debt is traditionally considered good debt. Why? Because traditionally, yes, you earn more money over your lifetime if you have a degree than if you don't have a degree. And pretty much almost double is the case. But that doesn't mean that you can't borrow too much money. You can, and a large percentage of American college students or former students are burdened so heavily with student loan debt that it stunts their professional career. So minimize the amount of debt. And I use the rule of thumb, which is pretty standard across the industry suggestion. How much debt is too much debt? Well, find out realistically how much you can expect to earn your first year out of college. If it's $30,000, the rule of thumb says don't borrow more than $30,000. That's I think even then is pushing it. But the problem is some people will go into a career where they're only going to be making $30,000, and they might go to a small private liberal arts college and get into $100,000 of student loan debt, justifying it because, hey, it's education, and it's been ground into our heads that education is important and it's invaluable and so forth. And yet, $100,000. How are you going to pay that off when you get a job making $30,000 a year? Some people end up having student loan debts their entire working career, and that's a real shame. A lot of students don't hear this. It's probably mentioned in every student orientation, every student loan workshop that you have to go to before you can borrow money. But you cannot expect, even if you were to file bankruptcy, do not expect to be able to get rid of your student loans through bankruptcy. As bankruptcy attorneys would tell you, 98% of student loans survive bankruptcy, meaning in 98 out of 100 cases, bankruptcy cases that involve student loans, the student loans still have to be paid afterwards. You have to be able to prove not only that you can't afford it now, but essentially that you'll never be able to afford to repay that debt. What that is code for is permanent and severe disability. So borrow as little as absolutely possible. Don't borrow money and then use it to buy a car or to supplement your music downloads or to buy a TV or entertainment ideas or to subsidize your trip, your spring break trips. These are just not good ideas. These are things that you're going to be paying for the next 10, 15, 20 years. And as I say, not in a joking way, because it's true. If you use your student loans to pay for pizza delivery, that pizza is long gone by the time you even have to start paying back your debts, let alone by the time you actually pay it back. You may not even like that kind of pizza 10, 15 years down the road, or if you buy download music with it, and you may not even like that kind of music anymore. It's just not a good idea to use your student loans. It's not only not a good idea, you're not supposed to. The government does not look kindly on that. But do not use student loans to supplement consumer spending. Not a good idea, not smart, and I'm speaking from experience there. So these are the amounts that we can borrow. Absolutely minimize it. These do not include private student loans. Highly suggest that you minimize or avoid altogether private student loans. They have the same protection for the creditor, meaning the creditor is going to get paid. It's hard to get rid of private student loans, but there are some restrictions. There are fewer options for dealing with private student loans in hardship than there are for the direct student loans. So avoid those where possible. Don't say, well, I'm just going to get as much debt to get my education. All right. So passcode number 2, YARD. Write it down. You have to have this passcode if you want credit for this webinar. It's Y-A-R-D, YARD. Okay. During school, how do you minimize debt or avoid debt or or eliminate debt while you're in school? Well, seems kind of boring, but saving, why do I have saving money up there? And committing to pay yourself first. Why would that be in a debt elimination and debt prevention? This is not saving, this is debt. In my experience and my opinion, the commitment and the habit of saving something, even if it's just $5 a month, is the best indicator of future financial stability and success. If you are one that's going to live paycheck to paycheck, or in this case in school, student loan to student loan, and not have a single dime left to your name by the time the next one comes, you can pretty much bet that you're going to live that way most of your life until something drastic happens to change your way of viewing your finances. Commit to saving something every month. Unless you are completely unemployed and there is no income, no money coming into your checking account or your wallet, then obviously you're not going to have anything to save. But if there's money coming in, put it aside, because at some point you're going to need it. Work toward getting a $500 survival expense fund. This is money that you can use to avoid turning to these predatory lenders, payday lenders, title loans, pawn loans, very high fee, expensive loans when you're in need of $200 or $300, $400. Maybe you have to fly home for an emergency with the family, or a sibling is getting married or something like that, and you need to come up with some travel money. Or if your car breaks down and you need a couple hundred, this will help defray those expenses. So work on always having at least 500. The goal is to just put 10, 15% for your lifetime aside, but at least work toward $500. Then the next, so the second and the last key that I want to talk about in minimizing your debt during school is called, I call it the money pie. This money pie, it's the most delicious money you'll ever have. It represents all the money that you have available to you. And this example is, it's just an example. You can play with the numbers, the percentages, however you want. But it's a simple way of looking at what to do with your money. And so I'll just go through the 6 different categories here. First, I believe, again, it's my opinion, generosity first is not just good for our community. It is actually, I believe, a way of, one of the steps toward financial success. Being more generous, giving to our community is a way of staying connected and understanding what a true need really is and how blessed most of us really are. And it puts into perspective what we spend our money on. And we tend to, if we're more giving, we'll tend to be less frivolous. That's not a guarantee, but we'll tend to be less frivolous in our purchases and consumer spending. So give something, whether it's 1%, 2%, 12%, 15%, whatever. I've just got 10% just to make this whole pie easier to digest. So generosity first. Second, live on 50% of what you have available to you. And I'll give you a moment to all enjoy that collective gasp. How can anybody live on half of their income? Well, what I'm talking about here is not, it's less than what you think. Living expenses, that I'm talking about your housing, so rent or mortgage, and utilities, communication, so your cell phone, transportation, and food. Those are the general living expenses, and some clothing too. And so again, people say, well, how can I do that? There's no way. The reality is, and there are at certain income levels, especially on low income levels, which typically is a typical college student. This living expense may need to be a little more than the 50%. But on a full-time income, it's hard to justify getting into expensive homes and large car payments. It's a reality check for a lot of people, this 50%. And when they say there's no way I can do that, I have to remind them, well, you're going to have to, because otherwise, down the road, you're not going to have anything available to you when the hardships come. And if you're living paycheck to paycheck on 100% of your income, which is about 60% of the population of the United States, by the way, we live paycheck to paycheck, and only a small percentage of that is justified in a very low income. Most of it is by choice, and by choice I mean we choose to spend our money and not to save it for future. We choose to live today and not prepare for tomorrow. We get into homes and cars and get into entertainment packages and things that are just more than what we really can justify on our given income. But that's the living standard that we expect in this country. If you've ever lived in or visited a third world country, you know that that's true. If you've never visited a third world country, I would suggest it's a real eye-opener when you realize that we need a lot less to enjoy life than what we have in our first world countries. So live on 50%. Then, and as well, you know, in some cases that will mean sharing apartments with friends or doubling up with family. That means driving around a 10, 15, 20-year-old car. That's the reality. Because otherwise, we don't get to take care of these last 4 pieces of pie, and they're really important. The first one, to prepare 10%, that is what I'm talking about here, is that short-term needs. We have to prepare for any expenses coming up in the next year or so, maybe 2, 3 years down the road. I'm talking about car repairs, medical emergencies. I'm talking about perhaps some appliances, furniture that need to be replaced, but also, those are things that we can't predict when they're going to happen, and we're going to need that money. We're going to want this fund, and we can put 10% away to help to minimize the impact that those events have on our lives. But also, this 10% can go toward the things that we should be planning for on a regular basis, but most of us don't plan for it until the end of the year, and that is things like Christmas gifts or taxes or birthday gifts. We don't plan because we're living on 100% of our income, and so we are just scratching here and there trying to find money. But if we can just automate 10% into some sort of another savings account for these individual expenses, and I have a whole other webinar on just saving strategy, which I highly suggest you consider looking at. And it'll go into more depth on the money pie. There's a presentation, also a webinar on the money pie, and on savings. But automate all these and consider having multiple accounts for these different purposes. So that's prepare, 10%. The next 10% is the plan. That's the long term. That's retirement. That is home, getting ready to buy a home in the next 5, 10 years, so you have some money down. If you could be putting 10% into, especially if you're starting while you're in college or even before college, have that as a habit. You will retire wealthy very young. That is the key, 10%. And then this next one, 10% learning. While you're in school, you can use that to pay down student loans that you have. Be paying on any interest that is accruing, of course. But but it also could be to help prepare for books for the next semester. Can help prepare for any other fees to minimize how much you're actually going to have to borrow each semester. When you're out of college, continue to use that. Some people will use that and split it for paying off some of their consumer debts, maybe credit card debt when they first start using the money pie, or to accelerate other debt elimination, like home loan, car loan. But you're going to want to continue to improve your education and to have continuing education your whole life long. Be a lifelong learner. And this fund will help you take advantage of opportunities wherever and whenever they pop up. Whether it's a continuing education program across town, or maybe some nice tropical location, which does come up, you'll have the funds there to do it, and you can kind of combine that with your vacation. So, but the real key to this whole thing is this last piece of pie, and that's the 10% for enjoying life. Without putting 10% into some sort of a fun fund, an enjoyment fund, entertainment fund, we're going to do that kind of stuff anyway, and so that will come, typically it comes out of some consumer credit line. And so we end up going into debt a lot of times, whether it's eating out, whether it's going to movies, whether it's traveling, whatever it might be. The reality is, if we could live on 50%, so meaning we're typically going to have smaller home, an older car, then somebody else who's living on 100% at the same income level, they might have a bigger home and a fancier car. But if they don't have the 10% of their income to enjoy every week or every month, and we do, guess who's going to be happier and feel more satisfied with their life? Those of us who can use 10% of our income to really enjoy whenever we want. That is really the key. So take 10% out at the beginning of every month in cash, put it in your wallet, or put it in your purse, or put it somewhere where you can access it, or put it in a separate put it in a separate checking account that you can use whenever you want. So that's the money pie, and that's how we minimize debts while we're in college. Other ideas, other ways to do that as well I've heard of are making sure that you're minimizing the dining out, as I mentioned, using a shopping list for going grocery shopping, and sticking with the list. And some people who might have an extra hour or two a week to do a lot of some of this, it's called extreme couponing, although not super extreme. You can really cut your grocery bill in half, and so that's a significant amount of money. Okay, so that's in school. What about after school? What can we do to eliminate our debt as fast as possible after school? So there's a lot of different options. Post-graduation. Understand that after graduation, there is a significant percentage of students who default on their loans. That means they stop making payments. They start missing payments, and they kind of disappear altogether from the creditor's radar. And they have to go find them, and then maybe they have to get a judgment against them and garnish wages and all that kind of awful stuff. But and some students are more likely, as a group, not individually, but as a group, are more likely than other groups to default on those loans. And so if you are if you're a student going to or planning to go to or recently graduated from a for-profit, also called a proprietary college, where they usually have a 1 or 2 year certificate program, they represent a very large percentage of those who are in default after just 3 years. That's the percentages that I've got here. 22% of student borrowers at for-profit colleges have defaulted on their loans within just 3 years. That's almost double the percentage of borrowers who have attended a public college. So be wary, be careful. If you're going to a for-profit school, some of them do great work, some of them don't. You can say the same thing about some public schools, the nonprofit schools. Some of them are way overpriced for what you get. Others are top value at very affordable prices. So look around, make sure that the certificate or the degree you're getting is actually going to increase your income. And don't just take the college's word for it. If they've got a career counselor and tells you that, make sure you go to a library, that you do your own research and get a third-party opinion on that. Okay, so we're out of school. And you start hearing all these terms as you approach graduation. Deferment, forbearance, cancellation. What does all that mean? Well, deferment means that no payments are due and no interest accrues. This is typically on those subsidized loans while you're in school, if you're enrolled, or if you're in disability rehab, or if you're unemployed in some cases, or on active military duty or recently active duty, you can get a deferment. Okay? That's not a bad thing, because the debt is not going up, but it's not going down either. So just be careful. At forbearance, no payments are due, but interest is accruing. The creditor is not trying to collect on this debt from you. They're not sending you bills during a forbearance period if you've applied for one or if they've granted one. But the interest is increasing the amount of debt that you owe. Typically, this happens during financial hardship or for extended illnesses. If there are, a forbearance is required if you're serving in programs like AmeriCorps or Peace Corps or other national service positions. If you're in a dental or medical internship residency, if your payment is 20% or more of your monthly gross income as well. So there are certain other situations, but that's forbearance. Cancellation also called forgiveness or discharge, there are certain circumstances when you are no longer responsible for repaying that debt. Now, very few of those are going to be a positive circumstances. For example, if your school closes and you borrowed money for that program, you're likely going to have your debt, student loan debt. There's a possibility that you can have it canceled or forgiven. If you withdrew from school and the school didn't appropriately refund your money, your tuition, that debt may be canceled as well. If the school falsely certified that you would benefit from the education that you got, and you don't have a GED or high school diploma, that's another opportunity for cancellation. Of course, if you die or if you are completely disabled, there's also an opportunity for debt cancellation. Bankruptcy, as I mentioned, it's very rare that you can get your debt canceled through bankruptcy. But there are other programs like teaching in low-income elementary and secondary schools for 5 years straight. You can have up to currently $17,500 forgiven. If you go into public service job after graduation, you make 10 years of payments, full payments on time. So, of course, that would not be the standard payment because that means you'd be paid off. But if you're in an extended program, extended repayment program, you make your full payments for 10 years, and you are employed with federal, state, local government agencies, entities, or organizations, nonprofit agencies that have been designated as tax exempt by the IRS, such as a 501c3. Go into public health, public education, public library services, that sort of thing. Look into that, because then if you make your payments on time for 10 years and you are in those programs, you need to look into the possibility of getting your debt forgiven. So this, as I mentioned, the standard program, standard repayment is 10 years. It's a fixed monthly payment. You at least have to pay $50 a month. That's the minimum. And it can be less than 10 years if you don't borrow that much, of course. There is a graduated repayment program. This means that early on after graduation, your monthly payments are lower, but they do increase about every 2 years. And again, they're payable after it's paid off after 10 years. This means that by the end of about 8 years into this repayment plan, your monthly payments are going to be significantly higher than had you stayed with the standard program. There's also the extended program I mentioned, which could be up to 25 years. These are fixed or graduated payments. So you could get a fixed payment for 25 years, or you can get one that is lower at the beginning and much higher at the end. The assumption being that you're going to be making a lot more money at 25 years from now. That's an assumption still. There's no guarantee. Things happen. So the faster you pay off the debt, pay down the debt, the better. There are income-based repayment plans. An income-based repayment plan, it means that your payment is going to be a maximum of 10% of your discretionary income. Basically, the difference between your adjusted gross income, which you look on your taxes, and about 150% of the poverty level for your household. So that's rather technical and to figure that out. But again, 10% of your discretionary income, which is the difference between your adjusted gross income from your taxes and 150% of the poverty level, which you can find on the Health and Human Services federal site, 150% there. Payments can change with income, and it can be payable up to 25 years. All right, last passcode, third passcode is BARN, B-A-R-N. Please don't stop watching at this point, hopefully, because on the quiz you're also going to be required to answer 5 questions. But the third and last passcode is BARN, B-A-R-N. There is a pay-as-you-go or pay-as-you-earn, option. This is, again, 10% of that discretionary income. And not all of these repayment plans are available on every kind of student loan. There's a lot of different types of student loans. But if your if your type of loan has a pay-as-you-earn, it can be repaid over a 20-year period. There's income contingent, which is payable up to 25 years. The payments are calculated every year based on adjusted gross income and total debt and so forth. There is the next one is income sensitive, payment based on your annual income. It can change and does change with your income. It is payable, has to be repaid within 10 years. So that is kind of a brief overview of the various options for repaying your debt. Please look at the additional everyday money workshops. Go to debtreductionservices.org. We're going to have our online webinars there. I have here that if you're looking specifically for educational programs on student loans, I hold this organization in high esteem. It's called SALT. The program is saltmoney.org. It's I believe it's the American Student Assistance, or ASA.org, I believe. They have some great information on student loans. But this webinar is a good starting point for you. Feel free to contact us for additional information or for additional resources. We can point you in the right direction anyway. But at this point, here are the 3 takeaways from our webinar. 1, take advantage of savings projects before going in or while you're in school so you can minimize how much debt or at least minimize how much taxes you have to pay. 2, plan your spending well while you're in college. Minimize your debt by having a budget, living within a budget, use that money pie. And then 3, understand your long-term debt repayment options. Use the one that's best for your situation. But in general, the faster you pay down the debt, the better you'll be off financially in the long term. Otherwise, the longer you take, the more interest is added and the more you have to pay. Thank you very much for joining me today. I appreciate it and glad you joined me. If you have any questions, do give us a call. Do send us an email, education@debtreductionservices.org, or give us a call toll-free, 877-688-3328. Ask for education. We're happy to help out. Do a lot of free programs if you'd like a speaker for your group. Thanks for joining me, and have a great day.